The African Development Bank says more than $1 trillion have been illegally transferred out of Africa over the last 3 decades. Now African leaders are meeting to try to end the free flow of cash. So where's the money been going, and how can Africans fix what has become an expensive problem? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, last year, the African Development Bank found that Africa's economy is growing faster than any other continent. But many millions of its people remain in poverty. The organization says that Africa's development has been seriously damaged by the illicit flow of money out of the continent. It's estimated that around $1 trillion have disappeared from Africa since 1980. Every year, as much as $100 billion flows out of Africa's economy because of things like corruption, money laundering and tax evasion. In some cases, the money that's lost by individual countries is as much as 10% of their gross domestic product. The illicit outflow of cash has grown in size over many years, an average of 11.9% every year over the last 4 decades. The amount of money lost to Africa would not only be enough to wipe out its external debt of $250 billion, but could also leave $600 billion left over to fight poverty. So how do these huge numbers affect everyday life in Africa? Well, from Nigeria, Ahmed Idris has more.
Drivers in Abuja get their tanks filled with petrol that's already traveled many kilometers. It is produced locally, then exported for refining, and finally re-imported for sale to the Nigerian public. Nigeria lacks the capacity to extract and export its 2.5 million barrels of oil a day, so it needs investors. And when some of them come, they underreport the amount they produce and the profit they make in a trend called mispricing. The enormity of this problem has forced Nigeria and other African countries to seek international help.
It's a challenge that results in illicit financial flows from the entire continent. And, sometimes when you have natural resources, some of the natural resources contracts and the way they are shaped also allows room for some of these things to happen.
This is how some companies do it. If the current price of oil is $100 a barrel, a multinational oil company based in Nigeria may sell its oil at artificially low price of $60 a barrel to its subsidiary in a tax haven like Liechtenstein. The company declares little profit and pays low taxes in Nigeria. But the subsidiary then sells that oil to a third party in the United States at the true market value. The profit stays in the tax haven, and Nigeria loses out on the tax revenue it's owed.
Because people are getting so much tax, so much concessions, and declaring so much profit, and the country that is producing this thing is not benefiting from it. And ultimately, it affects our development.
Activists blame weak laws and poor enforcement. But tax authorities here say that is about to change.
Yes, in the past we take the prices given to us by the COMD, hook, line, sinker. We don't go back to start saying, oh, this is not right, this is right. But going forward, we are looking at the arm's length principle application as they apply.
In this case, to make sure a Nigerian subsidiary is not used as a front to evade taxes or hide income.
Economists say the country has no business being poor if taxes are duly collected and utilized. The problem is many individuals and businesses don't pay. That is because most of them do not see the need to do so, when a small bribe can save you a lot.
It is this attitude and the illicit financial dealings of big business that experts say is preventing growth. It's also further impoverishing a population where more than 60% lives on less than $2 a day. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Nigeria.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by our 3 guests. From London, we have James Schneider, editor of Think Africa Press. James specializes in equitable development in Africa. From Nairobi, we have Aly-Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management. Aly-Khan is also an economist and author. And joining us via Skype from Victoria, Francois Ndengwe, founder of the African Advisory Board dealing with Africa's economic development. Francois is also the founding member of the Congress of African Economists. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Now, Francois Ndengwe, let me start with you. Why is this happening, and what is it about Africa's system that allows this to happen?
Mainly there are three channels. The first channel is relating to corruption. The second one is tax evasion, and the third one that has been explained in the case of the oil in Nigeria is what is called the price transfer. So we have to look at these three main channels to see how to fight this illicit financial outflow from Africa. Corruption, tax evasion, mainly by transnational companies, and price transfer.
Aly-Khan Satchu, I mean, what do you think is the biggest problem here, and where does it start, do you think?
I think there are a number of narratives within the main story. I mean, firstly, Hazem, you know, we've got a transfer pricing issue with the multinationals. We've also got an internal corruption issue in many of these countries. I saw research recently which estimated corruption in Nigeria is costing 25 cents in each dollar, and that's internal corruption, that's political corruption. You've got all kinds of other illicit flows flowing from poaching. We've got drug money. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was a drug seizure just off the coast of Mombasa. $300 million haul. I mean, these are huge amounts. And I think the problem is we got weak governments, too many post boxes, a lack of coordination. And when you take all of that into the mix, the number the AFDP have put out is entirely credible. And what it means is that this liquidity, $1 trillion, which in today's value is probably even higher, is not being put to work on the continent. It's sitting for the most part in Western economies, financing their economies and not ours. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I like to think there's much more information and visibility around this issue now, but really it needs a big effort. And right now, Africa needs all the money it can get for this big expansion in its infrastructure that the AfDB is promoting as well.
Yeah, James Schneider, the problem is the sheer complexity of all of this, isn't it? Trying to track where all of the money is going, and the fact that there isn't one sort of agency that can keep track of all of that, isn't it?
That's exactly right, but it's a designed complexity. So the way in which these things are facilitated are through or done via seemingly very respectable looking accountants, investment bankers, private equity funds and hedge funds, a lot of them sitting very close to where I'm talking to you from now. And this level of complexity and secrecy running through these banking secrecy zones about which we can, by their very nature, know little, it's designed to be complex because this is, if we put it bluntly, an extremely complex fraud, an extremely complex theft on an enormous scale.
Aly-Khan Satchu, I mean, what's the main motivation for these illicit flows, do you think? I mean, you talked earlier there about the impact of organised crime. Is it just that? I mean, there are institutions, seemingly perfectly legitimate institutions, that are also benefiting from this as well, isn't there?
Absolutely. You can imagine there's a lot of cheap money sitting in, well, there was, in European and Swiss bank accounts. I think the Europeans, and in particular the Swiss, have become far stricter of late around these sorts of flows. And I think that's led to diffusion of the cash that used to automatically go to places like Geneva is now probably going to new places in Asia and in Latin America and all kinds of other places. So, like your guest said in London, you know, we're trying to track very complex flows, and what we've got are enormous flows in the background as well. As I mentioned, just one Dow was holding $300 million worth of heroin. I mean, you can imagine that's that's bigger than the single biggest FDI in Kenya in the last 4 years. So you can see how we've got this very distorting effect. And we've got other countries where, 10, 20, 30, $40 million probably buys the country lock, stock and barrel very effectively. And that's making it even more attractive to people with sort of nefarious intentions to come and set up on the continent. The fundamental issue, I think, is around repricing, transfer mispricing. And the second issue, really, we can blame other people, but we've also got to blame our politicians, because come campaign time, they're looking for enormous quantums of money and entering into all kinds of transactions to make sure they get that cash. And I haven't seen a significant improvement in the behavior of our politicians in this area either.
All right, well, let's just remind ourselves then of how this money disappeared. As we heard earlier in our report there, Africa's natural resources are sometimes sold at an artificially low price to Western tax havens. This means companies avoid paying the correct rate, meaning Africa loses out on its tax revenue. Some of the outflow is created by laundering profits from criminal activity. Often this means money earned by cross-border smuggling of drugs and people. There's also a lot of corruption, theft of state assets and bribery of public officials add to the amount of money lost from Africa's economy. Let's talk a little bit more then about the effects of all of this on Africa's people. And Francois and Ndengwe in Victoria, I want to turn to you on that. What are some of the ways in which this affects average Africans? Obviously, a lot of money that is supposed to go to benefit them is going out.
Of course, there is direct effect in terms of social effects. But schools are not built, roads are not built, people do not have the health care they deserve. But I want to come back to the issue of corruption. And in fact, when you look at corruption in Africa, you have to speak more in terms of co-corruption. When you want to study something like corruption, you have to look at its history. What is the history of corruption in Africa? You remember that corruption has been encouraged in Africa by Western countries, in particular OECD countries. How? For more than 2 to 3 decades, you have in those countries, you have what they call tax deductibility, meaning that a country from the United States, from UK, from France, a company from all of these countries could go in Africa and they will corrupt governments, they will corrupt officials, and they will come back in their countries and they will have tax deductibility of the money that they used to corrupt. This is how the seed of corruption was sowed in Africa, and for decades, OECD countries have in fact encouraged corruption in African countries. This started to stop, and it's not stopped yet properly, with the OECD Convention on anti-corruption of officials, that at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s. But the effect is there, is that you have created a habit of corruption in Africa where it didn't exist before. So if you want to tackle corruption in African countries and in this illegal financial flow, corruption is one major channel. You have to tackle corruption. And this, in my view, OECD countries, governments are not ready to go against this very defective thing of co-corruption in their countries.
Aly-Khan Satchu, a lot of these corruption cases involve what are anonymous shell companies that are kind of fronts for this sort of illicit activity. Just explain to us how that works.
Well, let's take some examples. There were a flurry of transactions in the Democratic Republic of Congo before the last election, essentially transacted through places like the Bahamas. The shell company was anonymous, but it was clearly obvious who the real beneficiaries behind that shell company were. So it's a fiction in a way. It's a technicality. Corporate law in a place like the Bahamas does not allow you to see through the company to who the real beneficiary owners are. So it's very much, you know, this has been, this game has been in play for more than a century all over the world. It's no different to what they're doing on the continent. The shell company basically accrues a big one-off fee, or alternatively, it gets some kind of rebate, some kind of brokerage fee, and that money is essentially diverted out of the continent. And this is happening on a very big scale. And it spikes every time there's an election in any country. You'll see these kinds of transactions going down. Very difficult to measure, because sometimes, you know, you're talking about billions of dollars of economic value being given away for $30 or $40 million of cash right now. And, you know, to compute the consequential loss on the country, it's really enormous. And the consequences of that are somewhere like the DRC. You know, there are hardly any roads there. The development has not been what it could have been. So cause and effect very much there. And, you know, schemes are, I don't think that as complex, you know, I think they're very straightforward. It's schemes which have worked for 50, 100 years, continue to work. Maybe the US, Europe has closed some of these schemes down, but there are plenty of other operators on our continent who see that as an opening, I'm afraid.
James Schneider, I mean, there has been, to be fair, a lot more attention devoted to tackling this problem in the last few years, particularly from international institutions. But despite that, it still seems to be going on, you know, almost just running rampant, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of a stop to it. Why do you think there is? Is there just a lack of a political will?
Well, it's an enormous problem which goes right to the heart of how the global economy is structured. I mean, the conservative estimate for the percentage of global wealth which is held in tax havens is something like 10% of global wealth. This is a huge global problem. And there has been some movement recently which is positive, and for example, David Cameron has called on the tax havens, the overseas territories which are semi under British jurisdiction, to publish registers of who actually owns shell companies. Whether actually anything will happen on that or not is unclear. But the problem is that in the Western countries, that the politicians I'm not saying that there's direct corruption, but they form the same kind of social groups with very respectable seeming people who are essentially handling stolen goods. Your accountant who is helping set up this flow so that a company that is extracting some material, some natural resource from Africa, cannot pay the proper price for it, is handling stolen goods. And because we don't have the kind of firm legal structure that will bring those people to book, there is a large degree of immunity essentially for these actions.
Aly-Khan Satchu, is there, I mean, I know we kind of talked about the fact that there are a lot of vested interests in this, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why there isn't as much of a political will to take this on. But is that all there is to it? Are there more factors at work, you think?
No, I think you're right. I think you've got people, very powerful vested interests, whom it suits perfectly well to work within this kind of system. I mean, whether it's a multinational company, whether it's a political party that's sitting in power, wants to raise a bunch of cash in order to win the next election, the system seems to me to be optimized for exactly these sorts of folks. I don't know what the silver bullet is that's going to rescue Africa from this, and it definitely needs rescue. You can imagine if $1 trillion could be put to work right now, what an incredible outcome we would have from it. But I think it requires much better state-level coordination. It requires much better coordination at the AU. It requires a degree of cross-border forensic analysis and follow-through that I don't see is there yet. And it also requires some kind of pressure from the people on their governments to do something about it. And I think there is increasing pressure. There's much better information, feedback about these kinds of things. But I don't think we've hit the tipping point when, African citizens all over the continent stand up and say enough, and, we're going to put a stop to it. I haven't seen that moment yet, but I think, this sort of program, the AFD publishing this kind of information is a step forward, and I think that's a good thing.
Francois Ndengwe, how much of a knock-on effect does all of this corruption have on trying to get money into Africa, particularly when you're looking at NGOs, for example? How much is there? I mean, when you hear all these stories about corruption and money going to the wrong people, does it discourage outside donors from investing in Africa, from sending aid to Africa, do you think?
I don't think so. I think that these donors, mainly their company, they love corruption in Africa. They want corruption to grow in Africa because they prosper on this corruption. If you look at international institutions that we think could have been in charge of fighting corruption in the continent, the IMF or the World Bank, if you look at the World Bank, for instance, it is only when President James Schneider arrived that the World Bank started to speak and to deal with corruption. Before, the World Bank just turned its eyes on the other side and refused to see the effect. We may pay homage to President James Schneider. This is the World Bank in the beginning of the 2000s. But before that, the World Bank did nothing. If I take the case of the IMF, if you look at even the IMF managing director now, Mrs. Christine Lagarde, Christine Lagarde, as you know, was the former French finance minister. And there is a very particular case. Money doesn't disappear. Money doesn't evaporate. If you look at the countries that are under the umbrella, so-called, of France, in what you call the monetary union called zone franc, they share the one currency, which is the CFA franc. One feature of this monetary union is that these countries are forced to deposit their reserve in the French treasury, and the amount is very high. From the 60s to the 1973, they were forced to deposit 100%. I say 100% of their reserve in the French treasury. This is African countries, a group of 15 African countries subsidizes France. And the IMF, who is supposed to help this country, is an accomplice. Mrs. Christine Lagarde is an accomplice of things.
Aly-Khan Satchu, what about the perception issue here and the effect that has on future investments in Africa?
Well, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Over the last 24 months, 2012, 2013, we've had very strong stock markets, very strong inflows coming into Africa, essentially a consequence of the fact global pension funds had very little or zero allocation to Africa, and they woke up and, and thought to themselves, we've got to move from zero to something less egregious. What's interesting in 2014, this money has become more, it's differentiating. You can see that the Ghana cedi has been in free fall since 2013. Investors are losing faith in Ghana policymakers, so we've had more differentiation. But so far, Hazem, what's interesting is that these investors are looking through this story. I mean, they seem to be saying to themselves, well, these are frontier markets, it's suboptimal, but we'll continue putting money in because the opportunity is so big. And similarly, they're hurdling what is becoming a very, very big spike in insecurity, with the Boko Haram, the Al-Shabaab. So for now, the money flows into the continent predominantly from the big pension funds, has remained resilient and a rising tide, and is able to hurdle these very issues you're bringing up. I don't know what might tip it in the other direction, but currently it's taken Sanusi's claim that $20 billion went walkabout in Nigeria. It's taken claims about Angola, Mozambique, all in its stride. And I think, investors seem to be at that point when they're just saying, buy me some Africa. This is going to be a big continent. I need to get a piece of it.
I'll give the last word to James Schneider. Are you ultimately hopeful that the tide may be turning here, given that this problem is getting a lot more attention now?
I think we have to be hopeful, and we have to look towards kind of growing awareness and activism across the world on this issue. So in Nigeria, for example, you've got an organisation like Budget NG, which provides scrutiny over what's going on in the Nigerian budget. in Britain, in the US and elsewhere, there's activism going on trying to bring greater attention to this, do the research and bring out just how huge a problem this is. It's such a pressing global justice issue, and it requires a united across the world response from citizens.
All right, and on that note, we've got to leave it. Thank you to all of our guests, James Schneider, Aly-Khan Satchu and Francois Ndengwe. Thanks very mumuch for being on Inside Story. And as always, you can add your voice to the discussion online. We're on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or get in touch with us on Twitter @AJ Inside Story is the name there. For everyone here, I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.